Hello, and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Weary, and I'm here today with Dr. Caroline Dodd Pennock, Senior Lecturer in International History at the University of Sheffield. And we're talking about her book, On Savage Shores, How Indigenous Americans Discovered Europe. Dr. Pennock, wonderful to have you on today.
Thank you so much for inviting me to come and talk about the book.
So, why this book and why this area of study? What's been your own personal journey, and what led you to write this?
I have a very boring origin story in that I was just really interested in history when I was growing up. It was something that really fascinated me always. And when I started learning about Aztec Mexica history, which is where I started, I was really intrigued by how big the gap is between public perceptions of what are often called the Aztecs. They called themselves the Mexica, so I kind of compromise. And this bloodthirsty, human sacrificial culture that is so often stereotyped, and then the reality of that society, which has universal education, unlike any other early modern culture I know, is compassionate and they love their families and they have kind of relative gender equity for that period of history. And so that disconnect between the stereotype and the reality really fascinated me. And by the time I went to university, that was something I knew I wanted to study. That was what my first book was about, that came out of my PhD, was about trying to understand Aztec culture as a society where people could commit human sacrifice without being dehumanized by it, trying to understand that balance. And then the more I worked on indigenous cultures as a person in Europe, the more I realized how much we talk about white people mostly, and sometimes African and African descended people going west, and so little about indigenous people coming east. And so I started looking out for those people in the sources. And the more you look for them, the more you find that there are actually really a lot of them. And at a moment when we are thinking, I think here in Europe about how diverse actually European history has been. There's been a lot of great work by people like Oliver Totele, David Shoga, bringing Black histories to British consciousness, for example. Indigenous histories still haven't really formed part of that discussion in particular. And so I was quite keen to bring that to that debate at this moment, I think, in time when migration, it feels like migration is this really sharp debate right now, but actually it's something that's been going on for millennia. And so it felt like something really current, as well as something that is a history that isn't talked about that much.
This might be a simple question. It might be a complicated question. You mentioned that there is this gap in indigenous history being brought to European consciousness. Why is that?
There are a lot of layers to this, I think. So on a simple level, I think that most people assume that indigenous history isn't really part of European history just because nobody much talks about it in the popular sphere. So one of the things I was really careful about is not to let my publisher say that this was a hidden history or a lost history or a forgotten history, because actually academics, indigenous knowledge keepers, activists, communities do know about some of these people. They've even published about them. But for some reason, their presence in Europe hasn't made a dent on the popular understanding of that period of history. And so it's that popular perception, that wider image that I wanted to change, which is why this is a trade book, a popular book. The other side of this is how indigenous histories are often erased from this portion of the past, in particular in colonized societies. Very often there's this idea, isn't there, that Europeans push into the frontier, which is an empty space. And that's all about taking possession of that territory. And the presence of indigenous people as active agents engaging with Europeans, not just in the Americas, but even at the heart of empire as diplomats and enslaved people and traders and travelers, doesn't fit very well with that narrative. And so there are at times, as I'm sure a lot of your listeners will know, deliberate erasures of the indigenous perspective, or they're elided into national narratives where they're just collaborators, or Thanksgiving is the obvious example, isn't it, where they're the kind, supportive, community-based organizers with, I'm doing a horrible job of explaining Thanksgiving, but you know what I mean, that stereotype of Indigenous people helping colonizers. Now, I'm sure that most of your listeners know that the reality is far beyond this. It's been challenged in the public space in the US quite a lot in recent years, but less so in Europe, I think, and even in the US, that broader awareness of global Indigenous histories, of Indigenous people as not just tied to the land, which they very much are, but as agents on a global stage, often isn't talked about, especially in public conversations.
I think I was actually going to ask you about why publish it this way, but I love that answer came up in the middle of that.
Yeah, it's kind of central to what I'm trying to do, is that public. I wouldn't want anyone to think this is just for academics, because part of the point of it is to speak to that bigger conversation.
And in that bigger conversation, you start the book out with kind of this preface, this introduction. Well, I guess you have an introduction as well, so it'd be preface. But the about why words matter, how words matter. Can you speak a little bit to that, even as you talk about, and I'm going to butcher this, Aztec, and you say Mexica? How do you? Mexica. Thank you. Why it matters, the words that we use.
It's incredibly important to give Indigenous communities the respect of talking about them in the terms they would have talked about themselves, because their histories have so often been appropriated, misinterpreted, misrepresented. And so I start the book with just a very short preface about that importance of using respectful and also correct terminology for Indigenous communities. And it's particularly important because I'm a white woman working in the Anglophone global North. And so I really wouldn't want to ventriloquize for Indigenous communities or individuals or peoples who have, as I point out in the Why Words Matter introduction, a very wide range of opinions about what is the right way to talk about their communities and their histories. So there's no one right or wrong way to do this. And that has come up very sharply in the fact the book is now being translated into French and Spanish and Korean. I haven't had anything to do with the Korean translation so far. I'm not really any help there. But the French and Spanish, we've had really lively discussions about how best to write that introduction and also what words to use. So in French, it's not so common in French in France to use capitalization. So I capitalize Indigenous throughout as the political identity, much like you will have seen Black capitalized in a lot of places. In French, that's not common, but it is the best practice as established by Indigenous communities in Canada who speak French because of colonialism. So I really wanted that to be how we did it. But in Spanish, Indigenous communities do not capitalize Indigenous, indigena, because that's just not something you do in Spanish. So you have to find different ways. Words don't translate across directly. You don't use indigène in French because that is the word used by the French for their subjects and is a derogatory term, for example. So a word that is respectful in English is not respectful in French. So there's no right or wrong way to do this, but I wanted to start by making people think about that context in which this is all happening. We're not reading these histories, telling these histories, talking about these histories in a neutral space. These peoples have so often been the subject of oppression and appropriation and violence that we need to think about how we talk about their pasts in a way that is respectful. And so I wanted to do that at the beginning. I have a suspicion that it might alienate a few people who wouldn't be alienated by some of the content. So like you pointed out, I've got an introduction after the preface, and the introduction starts with gold and treasure and kind of really engaging story. And some people might be hooked by that who find that introduction a turn-off by the preface. I don't know, you'd have to tell me, but I really thought that was important to position myself and to make people think about how they talk about these histories at the beginning.
It's perhaps ungenerous of me to think that the kind of people who would be turned off by the preface are maybe the kind of people who wouldn't read the preface to begin with. So I think you might be okay.
Maybe it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because I want to speak beyond the specialist audience, but also there is a sense in which I am speaking to an audience of people who already have opinions about this, and it matters to include them, including Indigenous people, in that conversation. It's a really hard balance to
Yeah.
strike.
I'm also to use maybe a removed example of what you're talking about. Just because somebody is innocent doesn't mean that the words they use are innocent. So, for instance, my son came up to me the other day and he hugged me and he said, "Oh, I just love how chubby you are." And I was like, chubby. I was like, he's like, yeah, just like Nana. And I was like, did you call Nana chubby? And he's like, yeah, she was fine with it. I was like, don't call Nana chubby, you know. And he's 9 years old. He's
My
not.
daughter is 9. Yeah, I know where you're coming
Yes,
from.
yeah, he's not. He's totally. Yeah, he means it lovingly, but I'm like, this is something that we need to nip in the bud now, right? Like like you can't go around calling, like hugging people and being like, I love how chubby you are. That's like,
No.
this will lead you into problems. And so just because the intentions, because I think a lot of times people feel they don't recognize that they are caught in this web of history and they don't realize that it's not a neutral space because it feels neutral to them.
Yeah.
And so they use these words and they're like, why is everyone so mad? And it's like, we're just correcting. It's you're hurting people when you say
Exactly.
this.
And language changes so quickly as well. So
Right.
what may have been an appropriate accepted term, even a decade ago, people would have favored in scholarship, favored Native American. Now there's been a pushback against that because it assumes that the Americas exist before the arrival of Europeans. And of course, America itself is a term that is Eurocentric. It's imposed by colonizers, or maybe I'm being Eurocentric in assuming it's a European term. It's imposed originally by Europeans, but by settlers. It's a settler term. It's a term that is imposed by European descended peoples, let's say. And so it can be really problematic just to say that. But then there are plenty of indigenous peoples and communities who would call themselves Native American or Indian, but by their own ideally tribal or community names. That tends to be the most favored. But of course, when you're doing what I'm doing, which is to give this big picture, you can't give individual tribal names all the time. So I tend to favor indigenous just as it's the one term that tends not to offend anybody. But even then, you have to deal with the fact that you're talking to people in a public space who need to know who you're talking about. So my title says Indigenous Americans, even though, as we've just said, American itself might be a problematic word. But if I just say Indigenous in the title, I could be talking about Maori people or Sami people or, Indigenous peoples in India or Africa. You've got to operate, as you say, in a space where language changes, meanings change, and it's not always about intent. People very often are not operating with malicious intent by most of the time, I think. And so just being able to say, actually, that's not the best way to talk about it, and here's why, I think can be a really powerful thing.
Yes. And what's interesting, you point this out, at certain points in time, different groups are created. And in order to create change, in order to kind of create cultural capital, the group identity has to stay the same. So you talk about even like some of the more powerful political groups name themselves American Indian. And they keep that because you can't keep changing your name as an association every 5 years to reflect what exactly you want. And so it's one of those things where because that was formed at a particular time, that was the only, maybe not the only term, but that was the term that they chose to use. So then that becomes the appropriate term when dealing. It's complicated because the history is complicated.
Absolutely. And Indian still is very popular in a lot of contexts. Well, popular is the wrong word, still widely used in a lot of contexts because it's the term in the treaties. And so it is a powerful concept for Indigenous communities seeking to deploy those legal instruments in support of their own rights. And so it's important for them to claim that term in legal context, for example.
One, I'm really enjoying this. I have so many more questions about this, but I want to make sure we talk about your book a little bit too. I mean, obviously this is part of your book, but talk to us a little bit. You break the book down into like types of relationships, and the first one is slavery. Uh, Talk a little bit about what that relationship looked like as these, and I, you mentioned at the beginning that it's a slur, but I love the reversal of on savage shores,
Mm.
them coming to this horrible place called Europe, right? So, can you talk a little bit about that particular relationship?
Yes, I should be really clear that the title On Savage Shores, the Savage Shore is Europe. And of course, that's just as much a stereotype as the idea that Indigenous peoples, that term might be used against them as a slur. And I talked to Indigenous friends and scholars about whether to use the term, and not everybody agreed. Some people felt that I shouldn't, others felt that it was a powerful inversion. And in the end, that was the approach that I took. But I realized not everyone will agree with me. You can't please everybody, but that was what I really wanted to do, as you say, is to speak to the fact that we don't think about Europe as a place that is othered, as the savage other place. And for the vast majority of Indigenous people coming to Europe, they did come either as enslaved or coerced people. There were lots of independent travelers as well, but a majority, something like tens, possibly hundreds of thousands, came to Europe as enslaved people. We know that Christopher Columbus brought 3,000 people, just Christopher Columbus, in the first 10 years after 1492, Taino and Caribbean island peoples mostly. And the fact that licenses are being issued for the enslaving of Indigenous peoples who are then being shipped across the Atlantic is something that's often forgotten in narratives of the transatlantic slave trade. So this is a different kind of slavery. It is not on the same scale as the triangle trade, as it's often called, in enslaved Africans and African descended peoples. It's not that same mechanized brutality at scale, which occurs later. But nonetheless, large numbers of people are being systematically shipped to Europe in what's a model of the African forts. So Columbus literally has seen what's going on in West Africa, and he wants to model it. He says to Ferdinand and Isabella, we can bring as many of these people as you want. They are ideally suited to be enslaved. And so the presence of these people in Europe as enslaved people is something that I think we really need to remember as part of that story. There are also African and Eastern European and other enslaved people in Spain at this time. And it's something like 10% of the population actually are Black in Seville, for example. And we think you then are adding to that thousands of Indigenous people who are being enslaved alongside African and Slav peoples, for example. So you have this real mix of cultures, but also communities of Indigenous people emerging in Europe. It's principally Spain and Portugal where this happens in the early period immediately after first encounter, the first invasion in 1492. And what's amazing about it is that while you actually have tens of thousands of people being enslaved, the Spanish exert a lot of energy debating whether they should be enslaving people. And that's not just a false justification, I don't think, because you see very differing policies. The difference here with what happens in the US and Canada is that the Spanish and Portuguese are explicitly there because the Pope has said they have the rights to this land provided they evangelize it. And that produces an encounter in which they see the peoples of the Americas as potential converts, potential neophytes for Christianity. So they have to treat them differently. Now, that doesn't mean they don't treat them with extraordinary violence, brutality, displacement, enslavement, all of those things. But at an official level, you're seeing arguments about whether they should be doing that and to what extent they should be doing that and how they should be going about colonization in a way that you don't see to the same degree in Britain and the Netherlands and so on. So it's really at the forefront of discussions about colonization, as well as being something Indigenous people are experiencing. I think it's a lot better known now, isn't it, with things like Andres Resendez's work, that this enslavement is happening. He has a wonderful book called The Other Slavery, and he explicitly calls it that because it's a different kind of slavery, but is the other one to the one that we most often talk about, the enslavement of African peoples. And he estimates that around 1 million people are enslaved in Mexico and Central America in the first 100 years, and something like maybe 6 million people across the Americas, and that he thinks is an underestimate. Most of those people, it's within the Americas, but some are being shipped across. And so I wanted to start with that in the book, because coercion really is such an important theme in how all of this happens. I think I have rambled somewhat around that topic.
No, it's a great answer, and I love one of the things that is really useful, because I love reading the account of, like, I'm going to get his name wrong, Bartolome
De las Casas,
yeah, and there, it's so interesting, especially as you're talking about, you want to bring this to a popular sphere. And so a lot of times there's a lot of different responses that happen. And the important thing is to encourage depth. And so one thing that people will use this as a kind of a terrible justifications, like, well, not all of them, thought it was okay. And that's not a right response either. But there's also that response of, like, well, they were just their culture and doing what their culture is saying. And there's this habit of flattening people in history, of just like, well, they were just kind of like, superstitious. But what we see with what you're talking about at the imperial level in Spain, at the court level, official level, or with someone like De las Casas, is that people had very complex argumentation. Their consciences were awake and were debating these things. It's not like they didn't know that this was a problem, right? So, so there's also like an actual sharpening of kind of this accusation of, like, no, this was wrong, and many of them pointed that out and knew that.
Yeah, it's so important to recognize that people at the time did not think slavery was a good thing. When we say he was a man of his time, well, but Las Casas was a man of his time. Right. And you see that complexity in the fact that Las Casas, who has been called the defender of the Indians, that was his official government title, he advocated for the introduction of African enslaved people to the Americas in order to alleviate the lot of indigenous peoples to do the work of Europeans. Now, he later regretted that decision enormously, because he saw the brutality of the transatlantic trade, but he never regretted slavery. He didn't think slavery was wrong. He thought this type of slavery was wrong, or these were the wrong people to be enslaved. Slavery was a reality of his world, and he never opposed it. But he did fight for the freedom of individual enslaved people, something I learned doing this project that I didn't know before. Las Casas has these famous writings about defending the indigenous people, the short account of the destruction of the Indies, which is all about the brutality against the indigenous communities of Central South America. He actually appeared in Spain in courts in freedom suits for individual indigenous people, testifying whether they appeared to be Mexican, for example, whether they were speaking indigenous languages, because you couldn't be freed so I should say that the other way around. So one of the grounds on which you could be freed was that you were of indigenous Central South American descent, rather than, say, of African or from the East Indies. And so he appeared as an expert witness in some of these cases. And these cases are amazing because they give us the voices of individual travelers. They let us hear some of their stories that would otherwise be lost. It's ironic that some of the people at the very bottom of the rung, the most oppressed people, are the ones whose voices we hear, albeit through a kind of legal filter, because in order to try and gain their freedom, they tell their own stories in court. So we have amazing accounts. Like there's a young man called Martin who was enslaved to Gonzalo de Salazar, who was a famous, brutal figure in Mexican history. And Salazar goes to his village and he says he wants a page, a servant, basically. And Martin volunteers, his family volunteer him. And then the first thing that Salazar does is to brand him on the face. And it's just this incredible reversion of expectations of what Martin thought was happening. And it gives you that real immediate sense of what it must have felt like to him. And the legal case gives us this astonishing account of his transatlantic travels and eventually his appeal for freedom in 1536. And we hear what matters to him, why he was trying to gain his freedom at the time he did, how he ended up in Spain. And it's all actually in his own words. So the existence of this debate over the legality of indigenous enslavement in Spain gives us this astonishing source, this body of freedom suits, which is, they're just remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and this just shows the depth of my own ignorance. I didn't realize that De las Casas was, all I really knew about were his writings, because, that's kind of how it pops up. And then finding out that I didn't realize that he was okay with certain types of slavery, right? And I really appreciate, because the phrase I was looking for was a man of his time, because that is often kind of this flattening phrase. So thank you. And so we have like this coercion piece, and then you have what you call the go-betweens. And obviously that's going to be less people, but can you talk about what that relationship was?
Yeah, there are fewer people, but they are incredibly important in the encounter.
Yeah.
People who are either seized or sometimes volunteer as translators, as cultural go-betweens. Some of their lives are quite well known, like Manteo and Wanchese, who translate for the voyages of Walter Raleigh and collaborate with a man called Thomas Harriot in London to create the first indigenous alphabet, the Osamokamuk alphabet, the first indigenous North American, like US, what is now the US alphabet. And their lives are reasonably well known, I think, but they're emblematic of a much wider range of people who stand between European indigenous culture and travel across the Atlantic in that capacity, but are often forgotten about in the histories. We hear, Europeans talking to indigenous rulers, and we just read that story and don't go, hang on a second, how are they talking to each other? There's somebody standing in between. And what I wanted to try and do in this chapter is to make visible the lives of some of those people through some of those examples where we do hear their stories and their voices.
Is there anything that you think is especially helpful about understanding that role? I mean, obviously you have like they made it possible, but is there something particular about that role that was unique? I don't know if that question makes sense.
I guess I'm not sure, because in a sense they are often very distinctive individuals, the ones that have come down to us, who we hear about, people like Malintzin, who was Cortez's translator, who became the mother of one of his children, whose son became a sort of go-between in his own right, going to Europe as a very young man with his father, becoming a member of the highest order in Spain, living at court, being a mestizo, mixed heritage representative of his community. So in some ways, those lives are unusual, the ones that have been recorded, but I think they're emblematic of a much wider range of people who are simply typical. They're everywhere. And actually, they vary an enormous amount. So I mentioned Manteo and Wanchese, who in the 1580s were involved with the expedition to what became the lost colony, that people call it, at Roanoke. When they go back to the Americas, having spent quite a long time in London, Manteo stays allied with the British. He becomes an incredibly trusted figure. He helps with those beautiful paintings we think that John White created of the people of what is now coastal North Carolina. He is the only only indigenous person to be given a gun by the English in this early period, so we know they trusted him. Wanchese, on the other hand, the minute they get back to his homeland, disappears. And we're pretty sure foments revolution and discontent against the indigenous settlers. And good for him, he's seen the potential of London and said, right, I'm going to make sure that we act against this. We can't be certain exactly what he does, but that is what it looks like. And so you have these very different reactions from two men who are both quite clearly agents of their own fate. They're making choices about how to respond, but they're responding in very, very different ways, as you might understand. It's one of those stories where famously, of course, it says Croatan on the post, at the lost colony. Oh, it's a grand mystery. Manteo, who was with them, was left with the colony, is from Croatan. It's almost certain that he took whoever was surviving back to his community, and that's where they went. So I really don't understand the idea of this as a grand mystery, because once you put Manteo back into the story, it becomes very unmysterious.
Yeah. But I think the key thing is that you have to put him into the story, which is, goes back to our earlier discussion. One, thank you for your patience. I'm going to blame it on not having enough coffee, and I'm not used to a morning interview.
Sorry, it's the time difference.
No. It's entirely, No, it's entirely. I should have just had more coffee. That's the answer. But and I think that you touched on it. And what I was getting at with the unique side is that this idea of like a third culture, that gets created in between, and that's what we see with the go-betweens. That's what we see with the kith and kin, and obviously that's not going to be most people during this time period. But what's interesting about looking at this, what's unique about looking at this, is it shows how permeable, and it helps create the depth to the historical narrative when you're like, oh, we had one guy going to London, coming back and fomenting rebellion, right? We had another guy who was carrying a gun, and you have like this whole idea, like when we look at European history, we have this idea of what court looked like, and this idea of having indigenous peoples over there, like at court, is just not something that's just present in our mind. Can you, I think that leads us well into kith and kin, but can you talk a little bit more about that third culture idea?
Yes, so you have people who, as we say, are standing between cultures. There is a sense in which this third culture is emerging in the Americas as well, because indigenous people are being forced to give up their religions and cultures and to change to European norms and ways of doing. And often they resist that, or they produce a blended syncretic culture. And frequently, in fact, they deliberately deploy European cultural norms in certain contexts to their own advantage. So choosing to dress or wear a sword in order to make a point, dress in a Spanish way or a British way to make a point. But then there are a lot of other people who are traveling back and forth and are having to code switch, I guess is what we'd call it now, depending on who it is they're talking to and where they fit in that point of view. And like you say, we're not very aware of indigenous peoples at European courts. It's only later that we start to see people talk about the 4 Indian kings, the famous painting by Verelst, and those rulers who traveled from their tribal communities to negotiate at court in the 18th century. But that's happening from the beginning. I was talking to a specialist in Tudor history. She's written a book about Henry VIII, and she didn't know there was a Brazilian king at the court of Henry VIII. This is not hidden. It's not, I didn't find this in a lost archive. It is in a published collection of texts that he was at the court of Henry VIII, that he was there, it seems, voluntarily, because he left a hostage for his safe return. There was an English hostage. He didn't, sadly, manage to return safely. He died on the return voyage. Though the hostage was released, it seemed like the English were able to convince the Tupi people of their good dealings, and he was released. But he's there voluntarily, so far as we can tell. You have hundreds of diplomats at the Spanish court who are there arguing on behalf of their communities, their families, all from different points of view. So one very common sight at the Spanish court are the Tlaxcalans, who were allies of the Spanish during the invasion. You have the Tenoch, who were the Aztec Mexica people who were defeated and yet are there claiming to have been allies of the Spanish, because Moctezuma sort of helps Cortez at one point. So there's these incredible stories of individuals. I said you see them through the records of the freedom suits. you also see people at the other end because diplomats leave their own records. So you get these letters and writings. We have that incredible story, for example, about Don Juan Apot Batz, who is a Maya lord who goes to court to appeal for, he says, more missionaries and support for Christianization in his town of Chamelco. But in actual fact, it's kind of a cover for simply allying with the Spanish. He converts to Christianity in order to protect his people. He's the first voluntarily converted Catholic in the region, and he's doing it because he's seen what's happened around. As it happens, though, they're also the first recorded people to make drinking chocolate in Europe. They're making a kind of material, tangible impact as well, aren't they? But they're there as part of a long tradition of Indigenous diplomatic embassies, and they're treated in that way. And we can see them in their own writings. We can see them in the court records of the grants that are given to them. We can see them in the accounts of what's paid for while they're there. It's really fascinating how deep you can get into their experience at court, and yet how often they just don't really appear in that picture, except as curiosities or exceptions.
One, can I just say how grateful I am to have you on today? And I think part of it, I don't know if this is encouraging or discouraging. I think it's, I love that you are doing this work. There's so many names that you've mentioned, like, I mean, and then there's this well-known figure, and I'm like, I have no idea.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm obviously.
That's why what you're doing. No, I think it's great. I think this is wonderful. This is why you're doing what you're doing, because you're talking about this, and I'm like, I've never heard of Montejo Winchesi.
Okay.
And
I'm saying well known because I don't want to be out here like I have discovered these people, because I know other people have written about them. And so I guess I should probably always say comparably well known, as opposed to household names.
Yeah, well, I bring that up because I mean, this is part of your work to bring this into the popular sphere, right? Like, I mean, and I think it's great. I think, and I just also for our listeners, if they don't know these names, I'm like, I didn't want them to feel alone either, and so I think,
sorry,
I mean, even that's incredible. No. That's I wanted to.
But I don't want to talk for ages.
I know. Oh, no. I think that's meant to encourage you that what you're doing is very important, because like these are fascinating stories and they should be part of the history.
It's probably important to say,
and by that I mean the popular.
In the book, I don't assume people know who everybody is. In the book, I explain who those people are.
Yeah. Oh, no, I think that, I mean, it just, and some of it even opened up when you were talking about a tutor specialist who did not know that there was a Brazilian at court, right? Like, it's just, there's so many books that are published, it's hard to collate this. And so this work of like, there's a lot of important work that needs to be done, going from like these, I mean, I look at upcoming academic catalogs because I do this podcast, but I mean, how many people are like browsing academic catalogs and being like, oh, I want to hear, I want to read this like first century or, primary source text from the 15th century. That's just not, anyways. So no, I hope that comes across as encouraging. I think I love what you're doing. So I would love to learn more. This probably, I love to cook. I love chocolate. And so even as you talk about that, what can you talk a little bit more about the impact that they had materially as they came over to European courts?
I think one area that people probably do know reasonably is about what's often called the Columbian exchange, very Eurocentric way of thinking about it, the exchange created by Columbus of foods, plants, animals, germs, all of that exchange. I think people are aware of that to a greater or lesser degree. So probably in the Americas, people are aware of the introduction of wheat and grapes and olives and, all of this citrus fruit, all of this sort of thing, where in Europe we have and large animals is a huge one, obviously sheep and goats and pigs and so on, and cattle, where in Europe, we get the introduction of the staples of Indigenous culture corn, beans and squash, tomatoes, chocolate. And I think people do know that these weren't all always here, but it maybe isn't in popular consciousness that so many of these are indigenous practices as well as foodstuffs. So smoking, for example, is not something that people do in Europe before the encounter with the Americas. Smoking is an inherently indigenous practice. Every time people start, maybe we don't want people to do this now, but every time people start smoking cigarettes or pipes, they're evoking a long history of indigenous habit and ceremonial and practice. And the same with chocolate. You see the introduction of chocolate to Europe, and so often popular accounts say, oh, friars and missionaries introduced it to Europe. But the first account we have of people drinking chocolate is these Maya lords at court. It says they have containers of whisked chocolate. And that practice of pouring of chocolate back and forth is something that becomes so foundational in Spanish creation. Think about Italian cooking without tomatoes. It's just unimaginable, isn't it? Or Irish cooking without potatoes. And those things have been appropriated by European narratives. People say, oh, tomatoes are quintessentially Italian, or chilies are quintessentially Indian, or peanuts. I mean, think about West African cooking without peanuts or chilies. These things have been made part of our cultures with so little awareness of the people that they were connected to. And often it's hard to trace the people who are bringing them over and the people that they're connected to, because they become part of trade, part of catalogues, scientific endeavors that are being managed by white people. And yet we know that people were smoking and eating potatoes in Europe long before Walter Raleigh, who in British history is valorized as the man who brought potatoes and tobacco to Britain. People were smoking, indigenous people were smoking in Seville. We have record. People were eating potatoes decades before he even thought of going to the Americas. And yet he is valorized as this discoverer of indigenous products. And I think normalizing the idea that indigenous people are traveling takes away that distinctive kind of sense that Europeans monopolize transatlantic exchange. That while indigenous communities might be involved in that exchange on a local level, supplying furs and gold and silver and so on, that it's part of, often as part of coerced mining. I think people are aware that indigenous peoples were part of that network of exchange, but they don't tend to see them as part of the transatlantic exchange. They see them doing things on a local level that then are transmitted. And if we recognize that people are traveling as well as stuff, it kind of changes the way we see that network, and potentially also the way that things were received in Europe and thought about.
I mean, that goes back to your point, and part of what you want to create, this idea of indigenous people as agents, right? Like, it's like, no, the agent is Walter Raleigh, right? Because that's the way we tell those kinds of stories. And it's like, no, the Mayan kings brought chocolate, right? Like, we don't tell stories like that, and we need to. And one thing I really appreciate about what you're doing, and I'm just trying to think through the proper reaction and what happens. I mean, part of this is me living in Central Florida, and so there's a different culture here. But it's important to be able to complicate identities. And as you talk about this appropriation of culture, like, there's nothing like, it's actually, I love that, Italian culture uses tomato sauce.
Mm.
Right? That's great. And like, I'm very grateful for Italian tomato sauce. But what happens is people feel like something is being taken from them, and they feel like you're attacking them, sometimes, and that's a natural reaction of like, oh, I always thought this was mine. And it's like, it wasn't. And that's okay. Like, keep making the tomato sauce. It's really good, right? Like, it's like, but understand where it comes from.
Yeah, it is about that origin, isn't it? And it's just about, what's the word? So much of popular discourse about this, which we see either taking place in the media or on social media, sharpens all of this into a kind of culture war argument. where
Right.
my experience has been that the vast majority of people I meet, so I did, because of the book coming out, I've done lots in the UK, and also in Europe and the US to a lesser degree, lots of book festivals, literary festivals, history festivals, which tend to attract slightly older, typically white, not exclusively, obviously, but on average, the demographic skews older and white and small c conservative. And yet, my experience has been that the vast majority, overwhelmingly, the majority of people I meet at these things say, that's so interesting, I had no idea. And they just are very accepting of the idea that this is part of our history, it's part of American history, that we have this blended past, and that it doesn't have to be a conflict, that it doesn't have to, yes, we have to acknowledge the oppression and the legacy and violence and the legacies of that, which continue to impact on Indigenous communities and obviously other communities of color today. But accepting that knowledge, knowing these things happen, doesn't mean that you're being attacked. It's not taking something away from you. And my sense is that most people are okay with that most people are tolerant and accepting and want to engage with those difficult issues. And then, but instead we have this, I'm hesitant to use the word appropriation, but almost this appropriation of these debates for people who want to score political points by weaponizing narratives around identity in ways that set communities at each other, rather than trying to find positive ways to grow from that understanding of a shared past. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. As you talk about a shared past, even as you're talking about these different communities, one of the things that comes, we've been talking a little about third culture, is that it was just more permeable. Like, these were people, and they were all agents, and they were all interacting with each other. And yes, you can trace certain threads of like communities, but like, we can talk about this when we say our history, that includes Indigenous history, because not to go, to kumbaya or whatever, but like, I mean, we're all human, right? We're all like, I mean, and I think if we start to look at this as our shared history, that's a part of us starting to look at our shared community. And that's one way among many others that we can take a step forward to dealing with these sorts of things.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. And it's not about ignoring the fact that some communities have been historically oppressed, marginalized, subjected to violence, had their children taken, still are having that happen to them, being subjected to violence by the police on a much greater level than white populations, for example. There are real legacies of colonization, settlement, racism still present in society that we need to grapple with. But I mean, I'm not pretending to be an expert in that. I just try and learn and listen. But for me, making these kinds of histories better known, I hope, can be a small contribution to that kind of conversation. When people aren't able to create a fiction that Europe was ever some kind of perfect white past. There's a sense in Britain, which is obviously the context I know best, where some people think that immigration is a recent problem, that mass migration it's become much larger in recent decades, post 1950s. But nonetheless, we've had migration into and across Britain and Europe for millennia. And so the idea that somehow there's this Indigenous white population that is being threatened now, when in fact so many things that people hold dear, like fish and chips, were created probably, we think, by Sephardic Jewish immigrants to Europe and to Britain. Christmas dinner in Britain is potatoes, roast potatoes, turkey and cranberry sauce. These are all like classic American products. I'm rambling a little bit because it's such a difficult question, and I'm not wanting to come across as a kind of authority on multiculturalism. That isn't what I do, but it does feel like this is a moment where having these conversations, we're deliberately trying to flip the script and other Europe and see Europe as not as a center, but as a margin in some ways it's kind of important to do that now because of how appropriated these stories have been by people who want to set communities at each other rather than look for shared solutions to what are really very serious global problems that we're facing, inequities. Yeah, I'm rambling now, but I am.
No. I think it's really good. I think, and I want to be sensitive to about what I'm saying, but what I appreciate is I think that at least as I am listening to you, it's helping me to not see it as like, oh, that's for instance, in America, that's a Black community problem. It's like, no, that's our problem, right? And it's that shared identity because of a shared past. Not that I experience the same thing as someone who is Black does, but that I look at that as like, that is something that is like, we're a community as a whole because we have a shared past. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think but it's also, isn't it, about recognizing, and I've been very aware of this as a white woman from the Anglophone global north, that I benefit from the structural inequities that were put in place during this period. My voice is more heard than many Indigenous and Black and other minoritized voices on this subject. And I've been not unaware of the responsibility of that, of being given a platform, for example, to talk to you. And I really encourage anyone who's interested in these things to seek out Indigenous voices on this story, to read some of the great books that are coming through by Indigenous, right? There are so many wonderful Indigenous writers, and now they're getting into the public sphere more. There's a Ned Blackhawk's great book, The Rediscovery of America, David Troyer's work, Nick Estes, all these amazing writers who transformed my thinking and made me so much more aware, and who I learned so much from. And I feel really privileged I know Twitter has now fallen to pieces. I refuse to call it X. I know it's now
I still call it Twitter. I know.
I learned so much just from being able to listen to Indigenous thinkers and writers in that space. And I'm so pleased to see that popular publishers are now bringing through writings to a greater degree. We need to see more of that, but by Indigenous and other minoritized community writers. And I was so grateful that I met, because I'm based in the UK, which with a child here, and which doesn't make it that easy. I'm so grateful that virtual space made it possible for me to meet people like my friend and colleague Layla Blackbird, Kai Manoush Pyle, people like this who are doing Indigenous scholars who are doing really fascinating work now, and who were kind enough to talk to me about my own writing.
As we look at this upcoming week, what would it's different for different places, different times, different communities. What would you tell people to think on and chew on over this next week?
I think if you're a white person living in the Americas, or even a African American, maybe to ask yourself, do I know who the Indigenous peoples of my area are? Are there still Indigenous communities here? Are they the community that was there to start with? Because so often Indigenous communities have been displaced. And to think about why that might matter and why they might be in a different place to where they came from to start with. Just to recognize that mobility of Indigenous peoples. So often we talk about Indigenous peoples as tied to the land, and they do have, obviously, Indigenous communities have recognized distinctive relationships with the land. But they are also people who are urban, who are mobile, there's a great book called Indians in Unexpected Places, which takes that question on specifically. And maybe to think about reading something by an Indigenous writer. I mentioned several wonderful books. Nick Estes' book, Our History is the Future, which talks about the Dakota Access Pipeline as a part of a long history of Indigenous fights around water and land rights, is a great place to start. And so is Ned Blackhawk's book, The Rediscovery of America. All of these are written for bigger audiences. And I guess, that's what I've been trying to do in recent years, is to try and read more and more varied Indigenous voices. Of course, I always have been studying Indigenous voices in the past, but what I've been trying so much more to do recently is to try and hear Indigenous voices in the present. And we're lucky to be living at a time when that's more and more possible, when we are seeing more Indigenous intellectuals and activists in public spaces, and looking at where we are with the climate crisis. Hearing different ways of relating to the world is a pretty important thing to be doing at the moment, I think. I'm not sure I've precisely given a good answer to your question, but hopefully it's something.
No, that was
to
a great
on.
answer. No, Dr. Pennock, it's been an absolute joy talking to you today. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much.